Well, the pedal is a problem because you asked for half pedaling and things like that. So
Yes.
tonight, if we get it together, you will in fact see me up there doing it, pedaling it myself. I have a version of it that has pedaling in it, but it's not adequate. So
you're not satisfied with it?
No. So I'll be up there pedaling away.
Negishi, did he play with that thing or not yet?
Not yet, but he has a practice tape, which I made for him several weeks ago, so I assume that he's completely conversant with it.
He has not been in town most of the time. He's
Yes.
playing concerts, and he comes back now. He's back now.
He's back now.
And he's rehearsing all day today.
He left for Canada on
With the
Friday,
system?
Yes.
but he's had a tape with a click track, so
And is he inspired by the piano?
I have the foggiest
You
idea.
don't know. Well, we'll ask him afterwards.
Yeah.
The results.
May I continue the question? So, I think you kind of postpone the exact answer until you listen to the real performance today. But if the result is pretty satisfactory for you, is it acceptable for you to play, well, let's say, every alley or Xenakis, which has very, very difficult piano parts, to play those pieces by this clavier?
If the concert was going to be held, say, in the Lincoln Center, important one, maybe I would prefer a live performer of great skillfulness, because I don't know the system. If this develops into something fantastic, why not? I don't think so, but might. We have to try.
Yeah, I think my question is related to your aesthetic concept of difficulties, of your technical difficulties of your piece. And I think, as you know, for instance, Peter Hill, who is an American pianist and who premiered your Every Alley in this country.
Who?
Peter Hill.
Hill, yeah, Peter Hill.
Yeah,
It was premiered by Marie-Françoise Biquet.
All right, but he
In the U.S.
In the United States.
Yes, in New York.
All right, so I might be wrong, but he wrote he wrote an article in a magazine, and he says there are a couple of measures which is really impossible to
Yes,
play.
I know, yes, sure.
So could you explain the concept of your technical difficulties, which sometimes involves in the impossibilities?
Not always, but...
not always.
I think this piece, it is like in Xenakis, the same thing,
Yeah.
almost. Because it's like, playing is like sport. Athletics. So it's a matter, it's also sport, athletics, not only. It's athletics for the hands or the body, but also for the brain, how to invent new ways. But in these special pieces like Every Alley and Xenakis, the performer is free up to a point to make a selection of what he can play, with always a kind of sorrow, because he cannot do everything for him. So it's like a holy land that he can conquer sometime, maybe in the very remote future, or may never see. So it's a kind of tendency. And that is important, I think, for art to have such a tendential aspect to it. Usually it's not in the technology or technique of the playing that this happens. It's more on the aesthetic point of view. But then again, you have no criteria, objective criteria to say this is the best or this is worse, or feeling a kind of I mean, prescription. If this is good, then it's okay, or filling up all these conditions. There are no such things. This is why there are fashions. For instance, in piano playing, the fashion of the 20 or 30 or 40 years ago is not anymore actual, even by big important pianists. But today, men like Brendel is much more interesting. We think he's more interesting than Schnabel, because Schnabel was more linked to the 19th century, perhaps, with phrasing, with things like that. The touch of the piano, the presence of the sound itself. And everybody knows that Brendel will be changed to something else, like the composers, like music. So you are trying to do, in fact, to be eternal with a perishable thing as a composer. What? But it's good to try. This c'est la vie. What else can you do?
Well, I wanted to ask, I guess this might be a good time to ask it. I was wondering about a quotation of yours where you said something like that music was controlled entropy or attempts to control entropy or something like that. You remember that?
No,
I think it was in formalized music somewhere, where you say something like music is entropy or some way or some attempt to deal with problems.
Did I say that? No, I don't remember, but it's a fact. You can control not entropy, but something which looks like. Of course, you can control the entropy also. Depends on what? Depends on the thought and the technique that you use. You might, for instance, at a given moment, produce, let's say, sounds with probabilities. In that case, you have to deal with the problem of entropy. That is how much coordination or how much determinism you have to include or not in the thing, because you are shaping that.
Right.
So you can start with something which is high entropy value and then go to a much now in rhythm, in pitch wealth and things like that. Intensity, the sound aspect, that is the timbre of it, the evolution of the timbre itself in the tiny notes or the tiny sounds. When I say so, I'm especially considering the East Asia way of producing the sound with small glissandi, for instance, with biwa, or in the chant, the Indian. That is in order to enhance the phenomenon of the sound. You don't have just notes, that is pitch versus time with some envelope. You have more than that. So the music becomes no. Therefore, it's up to you what you want to do. It's not a general aspect of music. We can say that music is a kind of it didn't used to be. This happened since after the war, especially. What? That the regular deterministic exposure of ideas, when I say deterministic, that is periodic way, according to some rules that are more or less well known, was replaced by a more general thought in which things that are not so much or not at all according to rules, traditional rules, known rules, like polyphonic or chromatic or chords, in which everything is scattered, like what you have in the domain of physics or everyday life. When I say everyday life, maybe not much in the city. Of course, you can have that in the city with the cars. Right? But if you are in the country, you can see where there are cows. So the cows are always scattered like this, which is interesting to see what patterns they produce, like the stars in the sky. So you can, you have to enter into those ways of thinking today, anyway. That means that you have to study, up to a point, branches of mathematics and of physics in the schools of music. Otherwise, you are a dumb musician or composer. No, really, I'm thinking that because that was all my life, struggling to understand what is the difference between, should be a difference between music and other branches of the research of fundamental things of mankind. You have the same brain.
But do you think that, well, this is another question I wanted to ask you, and I'm getting ahead of myself because I wanted to ask you two more questions about what you just said as far as this idea of entropy goes. One is if you see that there's an idea of placing certain determined qualities upon your material, whether or not it relates to older ways of doing this or whether it's a way that's developed more recently, is there any inherent difference between the way that you try to control your material in and of itself and the thing that you impose upon that material as from without, as it were? So that if you have something where there are sectional divisions within a piece, do the type of more subtle inflections within a group, is that a different expression of this idea than the way that you articulate these things as far as the piece itself is constructed?
You are free to do whatever you want.
No, I'm curious about your own music.
My own music?
Yeah.
Well, there are things that I can deal with at the microscopic scale and even calculate that with a pocket calculator program. There are other things that you cannot do because there are no tools, as I said. So you have to rely upon a kind of intuitive approach, and so on and so forth. But you have to think about small scales, medium scales, larger scales, of course. Having in mind that what is interesting is the drive that a music could produce on the listener and on yourself to start with. Because this is the steam of specialty of music. If there is no such a thing, then you are more or less asleep. You fell asleep. You fall asleep. The interest is broken. You have to hold the music like this in order to understand it, which might happen also when it's with good music, because you don't know. You see, there is another aspect, not only when the things are knowledgeable, that you are either inventing them or borrowing them, which is not as good. That the people that listens to something may not know what happens behind it. So the first approach is a kind of overall, like seeing a wall. And sometimes the wall are nice scratches or things like that, and he enters. He says, well, that might be interesting. This is what happened to me when I heard for the first time Bartók, played by people like Yehudi Menuhin and Louis Kettner at the piano. And I didn't know Bartók at that time, and I thought it was like a wall of sounds. And the public was very furious at that. They didn't like it at all, and they were booing. I was not booing. Respecting the people that played it, and also because I caught some glimpses of interest in that. And later on, I entered in more and more, and then I loved very much Bartók. So this happens always. That is, you cannot dominate the material that you are hearing, listening, or seeing. The same thing for painting or even architecture. You do that step by step. The bad thing would be to say, well, I don't understand that, what an awful composer or artist he is, because maybe it's your fault. This is what usually happens. So there are paths that can be seen or heard like with high entropy, let's say. That is, it's without any coherence, and which is a good thing, because there must remain always a kind of small corner of mystery, of not understanding in every piece of art, which happens, in fact, with the time. With time, when this happens in culture generally. For instance, with the Egyptian culture, pharaonic, that was replaced by the Hellenistic, the Greek one. And then the Greek one was replaced by the Christian. And only in the 19th century, when Napoleon went there and the writing of the Egyptians was discovered by Champollion, the Egyptian study started again, and the artists started understanding the Egyptian art. And that is the turn of the century. So during 2,000 of years, it was underground, and suddenly came out. The understanding was, nobody cared of that, for that, I mean the artists themselves. The same thing, well, not the same thing, but something similar happened with African art, which was discovered thanks to the universal exhibitions of the end of the 19th century. And you know the anecdote that Chinese music was heard first by Berlioz at some such exhibition, and said, what an awful music, it's barbarian, we don't understand it. It's not music. And Debussy, years later, another generation, said, this is the real music, our music of the West is nothing. So these are ups and downs of the waves of cultural impact or interest. And you cannot control that, there is no way. So the poor musicians, and the pure ones also, trying to do their best, that's all. Mastering the ideas and the technology. When I say technology, not machines, but technique, let's say, of their own time, but also of the discovering new things, which is important. Something that remains in the past is dead, I think. A culture that doesn't invent is finished. I mean, yes, it's a sign of vitality. So this is why I think that it's important today to have these branches of sciences into the music schools, because they are part of music itself, or the thought. Music, what is music? Who can tell me what is music? Please, raise your hand.
I have a practical question about when you're composing. In an early stage, after you've set up certain procedures or ideas to structure some of the material, do you find that the material itself then causes adaptations in the procedures?
In my early years, when I was young, I had ideas and also oral experiences, and I wanted to put them together. This is what I did at least 30 or so years ago. That is, I have schemes and some experience, and I was working how to obtain a knot out of them, interesting one aesthetically. But sometimes I was carried on by the theoretical aspect alone, with the idea that I must go in this direction as far as I can to see what happens, if it is worthwhile or not. So then there were kind of discrepancy between, let's say, the aesthetical trend or tendency and the result, which was not so interesting in that kind. But it was maybe interesting theoretical way. So there was much of, since you asked me how I did, much of my work that was a priori, thinking and testing. For instance, when I wrote the Pythopracta, which was based mostly on probabilities. For months I tried to understand what it could mean. I was reading books of agronomy because they had used that in agronomical research plans, or biological. I was reading the books of Fisher, maybe you know him. It's very important in evolutionary biology, that Darwinian trend is very basic in that. And also Mather was another gentleman that wrote about biology, the application of probabilities in biology. So I was reading that and trying to understand how I could use these as tools in order to shape the output, the sound output. Months trying to imagine the result. So, but now, since I have a kind of become more lazy, for one thing, then I have some overall view, which is also dangerous, like being in a plane, which might crash, you know. So the way that I'm working now is step by step, but always in the back of the mind, having more general things, you see, and using, let's say, I can use for a section a stochastic approach, or another section something different, and so on and so forth. But there are many parts that I cannot understand why I did them. Suddenly they are there, and after I say, you think it's okay that? Maybe not. What can you do? I don't know. So I did it.
I have a question about the synthesis method that you used in Legendaire. It wasn't clear from the program that's exactly what you're doing. If you'd care to expound on that a bit more. You talk about computing the pressure time.
Yes.
Pressure over time.
Yes, that's an interesting thing. I proposed that in Formalized Music about 20 years ago. All right. You see, the sound synthesis almost everywhere is based on additive synthesis, Fourier, with sine waves, that is the elementary things. Although you can do that also with square waves, at least in mathematics, which is easier for the computer. But nobody tried with square waves to do that in music sound synthesis. I don't know why. So listen apparently this. But it's possible to obtain interesting sound synthesis patterns by using directly probability functions, interlocked or simple ones. And I discovered in the 70s, after I wrote the article in that chapter in Formalized Music, that there are some specific values of probabilities, especially the logistic in relation to barriers. I don't know if you know about these things at all. When you have a probability function and you accumulate the values, then you might get out of the limits of the hearing or the computer. So you have to put whatever you find in a closed, these are the barriers. That is, when something tries to get out of the barriers, it hits the barrier, theoretical ones, and it is brought inside, like when you have a bullet in a cannon. This is what happens. The bullet, it's forced to get out. It doesn't go out in a nice way, tranquil way, but it is bumped all the time on the cannon sides. Right? This is a mirror, kind of. You see where the movements are regulated by kind of elastic jumps from one to the other because you don't lose much energy. But you can also have more absorbing barriers, let's say. So if you have such barriers in your probability, then an interesting phenomenon happens, which is tends to transform your probability function into something which is more regular for the eye, that is close, not like a noise, but close to more sound. The difference of a noise and the sound, its regularity, let's say its periodicity or the shapes that happen. This is the difference, which is a aspect all over the universe. It's not only music. This is why music is in the universe and the universe is in the music. One of the reasons. So that means that the sound synthesis can be created that way, and this is what I did. That was in Paris in the 70s, and part of the sounds are produced that way in the Legend of Air, not all of them. And this is interesting to notate that this approach is a kind of with feedback. You have a result, and the result is fed back into the state chain, which is exactly what happens in the very fashionable today, dynamic systems. You have heard of that, haven't you? And the so-called fractals and things like that, which are based on such a tool or weapon. So but this is one phase, one stage. You can go do some more research and have.
It sounded like some of the sounds were concrete. Like I thought I heard an Mbira or something like that. Some piano.
No, piano. There were no piano. There were some African instruments. There were also some Japanese instruments like the tsuzuri. And what else? And also very simple medical tablets where you have the pills inside, and when you aluminum, you have some nice sounds. Cloud like.
So then they were feeding back into themselves then?
Not necessarily. No, the other one I was saying, it's mathematically programmed. Right? The other ones were more concrete, of course. That is from microphones. It's some transformation, simple ones.
When you say the probabilities were accumulated, what does that mean?
That means
that they were added, successive probabilities within a space were added together to.
That's right. Yes.
Okay, and so as soon as it aliased, you went down instead of going up.
Right. You have you accumulate. That is, suppose that you have you draw lengths of something. Then each length is accumulated to the next length is accumulated to the past. And this increases sometimes very fast or very slow, depends on.
So it's a Brownian procedure?
Anyway, yes. Yeah. Well, it's called either Brownian. Brownian is when they are discrete terms. Or random walks, when it is more free, it's continuous. Now, there is a book that has that. It's, I don't know if maybe there are more modern. I have to buy that book. Then, by Feller. Maybe you can find that in the library here. Probabilities, Introduction to Probability. There are 2 thick volumes that might help you.
Mr. Xenakis,
Yes.
I found very interesting your question about what is music. And I think you have answered now in this last phrase, saying that the music is in the universe and the universe is in music. So would you say that music is like a manifestation of our research in the comprehension of the universe?
Yes, it is also. It's not, yes, you can state it that way. But that is narrowing, I think, the role of human activity. it's not only to discover what is behind the things or phenomena that you see, because we are unable to do that, I think, is a deceptive or pessimistic statement. But you are constructing something different, and that's important. Not only by trying to discover what happens, you produce theories. This is your man's production, anyway. And in these theories, sometimes they coincide with you can do experimental tests and see that they work. But besides that, there is the effort that you produce these theories that changed your ideological environment, and that is very important because that's something different. And that might, to the end, after thousands of millions of generations, have the man construct a universe on his own. I don't see what you. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. Today we are destroying or constructing the environment on Earth faster and faster. But tomorrow, maybe we can change the planetarian combination, and even in many thousands of years or generations or whatever, if that lasts, we don't know how that is safe, or what will replace man. That being could also create its own environment on a very, very large scale. So this happens through all these ideas that are generated by sciences, by economy, by politics, even for politicians, by art, which are freer than other than science. Art has the property to be at the same time experimental and theoretical, whereas the sciences have to be experimental anyway, except for the astrophysicists who are really poets, because they cannot prove what they state, even if that is interesting. They have to wait thousands of years.
So one last thing. It is unquestionable that your voice, that your expression is heard by millions of people, I would say, a lot of people. How do you think that expression, that power, is intended? What do you intend? Do you have any special intention in that power? Well, in what you say? You know what I mean?
Intention to what? To do what?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is
to impress people.
Evident.
To impress people. No, I feel rather like that Egyptian who disappeared through this during millennia. That is, there is no give and take. Given that is, why would you like to do that? To have that thing, that thought. That is, you do that in order to impress people. It's like searching for power, right?
Excuse me? Sorry.
When you say that if the strategy of the music is to gain the positive vote of people.
No. What I mean is that your voice is something that, well, is received by a lot of people, and you are conscious of that. You know that thousands of people every year listen to your expression, and what I want to know is what do you try to do with that? Can you try to, if you're concerned with problems of the environment, do you try to, make people conscious of that thing, or you just try to express some beautiful scheme in order to make people reflection or something?
No, I don't think so. Yes, that's the last thing. Maybe is the most interesting. Although I don't care if it is shared or not by other people. You see, I think that man is like a blind being that does whatever he can do and wants to do, and sometimes there is a response of society or not, negative or positive, or even of the environment. But this is the depth of the thing. You don't know why and what you are doing in fact. This is what I was saying about the sciences, the same thing. The scientific world tries today to dig things, to discover things in order to have cheaper things, but it's not only that, it's much more than that. It's the destiny of mankind, of the animals. If you look at the past through paleontology, the development of all these organs, fantastic, that we have feeling or listening, not only mankind, but also even in plants, is something that is, you cannot explain. You can explain with some ideas that are fashionable today, but the depth of them, the real meaning of them, escapes for the time being.
I have a question about your earlier involvement. You were very politically active as a young man, and then I guess you had mentioned that in talking with Roger about how you moved on to art. And I think it's curious now how, not in this country, but in other parts of the world, there's artists becoming actively involved in politics. And there's Havel in Czechoslovakia, and in Peru, a novelist is a presidential candidate. And in is it Estonia, there's a music professor who's now the president of the country.
Lithuania.
Yeah, Lithuania, excuse me, yes, excuse me. Would you care to comment on your own attitudes? Do you feel there's any kind of link between politics and art, or if not, then how do they differ?
Well, it's a big question that I don't know if I can answer to that question. When I was young, I was reading Plato, because I was not satisfied with the society in which I was living, and I thought that Plato was interesting in that aspect. That proposed kind of government which was by how do you say, wise people. And also the equality between men and women, because at that time I liked to be in love with girls that had some personality. And also, well, by the way, I think I said about that last time, that the way that Plato tries to prove that women are also important for society, it's a set theoretical way. It's not, let's say, Aristotelian logical demonstration. It's a set theoretical. That's interesting. Close the parenthesis. And then with the Germans, when they invaded Greece, I was driven by more or less kind of nationalistic, chauvinistic, which was a good thing at that time, against the Germans, and I entered into rightist kind of organization. But then I found that they didn't say much, because I kept being unsatisfied with society. So I found that the communists were much more accurate in that direction, especially with Marx, that was kind of 19th century Plato. He was more or less saying the same thing, of course in the industrial frame. And that was the ideology. But then, before the war finished, I decided to do music, because even that I was not satisfied. And I promised myself, as soon as the war was over, to come to the States, because I had relatives, and to study archaeology, as I wanted, philosophy, physics, mathematics, and music also. Only these 5 things. That's interesting. I didn't want to go to Russia, although I was a communist member at the time of the youth communist. I was put into prison several times by the Germans. I was never killed. I was wounded by British tanks because then the British wanted the communists to put down the arms, thanks to the agreement between Churchill and Stalin. You know that when Churchill went to Moscow, met Stalin, and he says so, Churchill describes that. He put in front of Stalin a paper saying, these countries will be under Russian dominance. These other countries are British, or allied, not even allied, British. And he pushed that paper in front of Stalin, and Stalin said, we did like this. So Greece was part of the British island. And well, this is why there was such a war that was in '44. And I was leader of the students of the company that had the name Lord Byron, because Lord Byron fought for the independence of Greece. The mountains look on Marathon. Marathon looks on the sea. How is that? Oh, there's a Orpheus with his lute made trees, and the mountain tops that freeze bow themselves when he did sing. At his music, plants and flowers ever sprung, as sun and showers they have made a lasting spring. This is Byron, right? So then I was wounded by them, and I left for Paris, where with wanting to do music. No, I wanted to go to the States, but then I stopped in Paris and I remained there doing music. It was very difficult. But then I entered with Le Corbusier, and that was a very important thing. I didn't care for architecture. But Le Corbusier was interesting because he was working, searching things, and it was very close to what I tried, not what I tried, but the way I tried to do the music, composition. And so after a while I asked him, and we worked on several projects in architecture, like the convent monastery of La Tourette, some other things in Chandigarh in India, so forth and so on. And it's important if you can have two fundamental research domains, because one reflects on the other one. It's very enriching, at least at early stage of your life. Afterwards, I don't know.
So would you say that to a certain extent that music is serving that purpose, in the sense that several times this week I've gotten the sense that you've made analogies between music and other disciplines such as the sciences as being different facets of maybe the same
Yes.
whole? And I was going to ask, well, is there a reason, aside from the fact that composers will attest to some sort of inner desire and need to compose, is there a purpose for music? Or can this whole sort of research the universe on its, you know, aside from the, but then are you answering that with this statement that it's another influence?
I don't know if I caught your question, but I think that music can be something that will earn you some money.
Not yet.
Or maybe people like that. But I think that more interesting is when music opens up your eyes, not your mind, to things that, and when you can put into music many other aspects of knowledge and of intellectual factor. That is, for me, that is more interesting. Otherwise, not worth living at all.